Journal continues.
Representative Steve King, Republican of Iowa, sits on the ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee, here to talk about U.S. policy toward Latin America. Let's start with the handshake. It's something that we've been talking about with our previous guests. What was your take on it?
Well, I think when you see the image that's projected around the world, it sends the wrong message to the tyrants in the world and the would-be tyrants in the world. And Hugo Chavez has been a verbal attacker of the United States ever since he first came into office. And as he stood at the United Nations the day after President Bush spoke and called him El Diablo and said there's a smell of sulfur that still lingers here, of all the things he said against the United States, collaborating with the Russian Navy, bringing them down into the Caribbean, all of those messages are the wrong things. And that handshake with that smile, the style of the handshake and the little hand on the arm, a little extra effort there in that smile, that picture echoes around the world, and it says there is no consequence for challenging the United States. There's no consequence for working directly against us, even though, as President Bush said, that you had Hugo Chavez supporting FARC, who were the rebel insurgents that have been undermining the legitimate Urabi government in Colombia. So I think it's a wrong message. I think our foreign policy is weakened significantly, and I think it encourages our enemies because it says clearly there's no consequence for challenging the United States.
Congressman Meek, who was with the president at the Summit of Americas, was in the room, said, do we really want our president running around trying to dodge leaders who come up to him, and he was just returning the politeness and a handshake, that there was not any change in U.S. policy toward Venezuela?
I think that's where good staff comes in. I don't think the president has to dodge anybody. In fact, I think Kendrick Meek could have just stood between them, and that would have been adequate.
All right. We want to get our viewers involved in the conversation as well. If you're a Republican, 202-737-0001. Democrats, 202-737-0002. And Independents, 202-628-0205. What is your impression of the Summit of Americas and what came out of it?
Yeah, I don't actually know what came out of it. It's good to get the leaders together. I think that the United States has not paid enough attention to its Western Hemisphere and our allies. If you look at where our bases are, pretty soon, if not today, Guantanamo Bay is the most southerly base we have for our naval vessels to sail in and out of. We have not been as engaged in South America as we should be. The Monroe Doctrine is drifting away and falling apart, presidential election by presidential election. And when I go down to that part of the world, I'm amazed at how little the people in Brazil and Argentina, Peru, know about the United States. I think we need to do a lot more. So maybe, just maybe, this is a good start in spite of the image that was sent.
All right, well, let's hear from a Republican. David joins us from Oklahoma City. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for allowing me to be on. I would just like to say that I do respect President Obama in his policy toward Latin America, not only Latin America, but other countries that are former enemies of ours. And I think it's much like President Theodore Roosevelt, who always said, speak softly and carry a big stick. And I do think that is much like our American people. And I just hope we're whittling a bigger stick because we're probably going to need it. But I do think that it's a good policy, and I do respect it. Thank you very much.
Mr. King?
Well, thank you, David, and I appreciate the tone and the judgment that you bring to this discussion this morning, and I am hopeful that good things flow from this. I will say that I want to compliment President Obama for giving the order for the Navy SEALs to fire over there off the coast of Somalia. That was one thing that really helped our image. And if that had turned out the other way, if Captain Phillips had been still held captive, hostage, or killed, it'd be a different thing here in America. But that lifted us up, and I think that helps us, and hopefully that flows through our relations with all the countries in the world, including those in the Western Hemisphere, and especially the Caribbean and South America, where we need to do a lot more work than we've done in the past.
All right, Kathy from Oceanport, New Jersey, you're on the air with Representative King.
Good morning, and I want to say your screener is very, very pleasant. You know, Congressman, I want to know why. And you just put the words back into my mouth. Every time the Republicans, all they want to do is confront countries. They don't think any dialogue is ever needed. All they want to do is pick fights. And you must have a reason why, because it's not working. You guys are losing everything. Can you explain that, sir?
Well, we've achieved a definable victory in Iraq. I call that victory, and President Obama called it an extraordinary accomplishment. So that's one of the things that came about when we had dictators that were belligerent. I think that you should recognize that the dictators in the world become belligerent in almost direct proportion to the oil prices if they're an oil revenue country. And furthermore, there is a geopolitical contest going on, and it is playing chess and Monopoly on the same board. This was going on during the Cold War. The Soviet Union went bankrupt before they checkmated us militarily. Now we have that same scenario taking place in a different configuration. Putin is making the moves where he's seeking to put back some of, if not all of, the former Soviet Union. You have Iran that is working in a level of collaboration with Russia. The Russians built their nuclear electrical generating plant that's there, and you have the collaboration with the Russians and Venezuela. So we have to be thinking geopolitically. Some people believe that dialogue is progress. If you don't have any leverage, if you don't have anything to negotiate with, just talking nice to people who declare they are your enemies only leads us down a path to capitulation.
Luis from Fort Lauderdale.
Yes, I'm really tired of the double standard of Republicans regarding President Obama and his being friendly to Chavez and Ortega. Every president, including Bush, cozies up to dictators and leaders we don't like. Bush held hands and kissed the cheek of Saudi leaders. Bush said he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. Also, Bush supported China hosting the Olympics, even while China did business with Sudanese leaders who were culpable for the brutal killings in Darfur. So give me a break.
What about President Bush's communication with world leaders?
I think the lady makes a point, and I think it's something that should be raised, and the sensitivity that she hears illustrates my point, in that when we do cozy up to these leaders, it sends the wrong message. I think there is a different partisan perception that exists in the United States. If you're a Democrat, you see these things from one view. If you're a Republican, you see them from the other. What's important is out in the middle, the independents and those swing voters on either side, they'll have their own perspective of this. But I think that those illustrations, President Bush sitting at the Olympics in China next to Putin while Putin is ordering the invasion and occupation of Georgia, that would be an example of looking in his eyes and seeing a friend. I think that John McCain was right. I see KGB along with John McCain.
All right, let's listen to what President Obama had to say yesterday about the handshake with the Venezuelan president.
I have great differences with Hugo Chavez on matters of economic policy and matters of foreign policy. His rhetoric directed at the United States has been inflammatory. There have been instances in which we've seen Venezuela interfere with some of the countries that surround Venezuela in ways that I think are a source of concern. On the other hand, Venezuela is a country whose defense budget is probably 1/600th of the United States. They own Citgo. It's unlikely that as a consequence of me shaking hands or having a polite conversation with Mr. Chavez that we are endangering the strategic interests of the United States. I don't think anybody can find any evidence that that would do so. Even within this imaginative crowd, I think you would be hard-pressed to paint a scenario in which U.S. interests would be damaged as a consequence of us having a more constructive relationship with Venezuela.
That was President Obama on Sunday reacting to news reports about the handshake with the Venezuelan leader. Please respond then to the president, what he had to say there in his defense.
Well, the president said it's unlikely. He didn't say it was impossible that it damages the relations. And he said that even though he has a creative crowd, that they wouldn't be able to show evidence. Certainly not. This is something that is subtle. It's subliminal. It shifts the thinking around the world. if we understood the psychology of all the world leaders and all of the forces that affect them, then we could master the world. But this is not an exact science. And I think that the president should have had the kind of advisors that had this choreographed and didn't leave him in this position. Now, I can understand that if the president is there and he is before cameras, and he's essentially caught with a foreign leader like Chavez, it's pretty difficult to refuse to raise your hand and shake hands with someone who approaches you in that fashion. So I think it's something that should have been planned better, and I think that in his heart of hearts he knows that it was not something that turned out to be constructive, and it's not in the interests of American foreign policy. And when you have Chavez sitting there in Venezuela with pushing his level of Marxism around the hemisphere and around the world, I think that's something that needs to be directly confronted. But something that comes to mind when I see this image too is here are two world leaders that have both within the last month nationalized huge private sector companies. In the case of President Obama, General Motors and Chrysler, at least in effect, if not in actuality, and moved it down that path when he fired the CEO of General Motors and when he ordered that Chrysler merge with Fiat. And you have Hugo Chavez, who nationalized one of a great American company's facilities, Cargill's rice facility in Venezuela, just about a month ago. Those two have done the same thing to private business, and I think that image also will soak into the minds of investors around the world and where they want to put their money.
Is it fair game for Republicans to use that image in the next election cycle against President Obama and the Democrats?
I think it's fair game, but I think that there's a lot that will happen between now and the next presidential race, and it appears to me that President Obama has drawn a calculation that any elected executive officer has the maximum amount of political capital the moment that they are inaugurated, which happened just behind you here, half a block or so away, and I believe that he has determined he's going to use it as fast as he can to accomplish as many things as he can. That's why this is coming at us like a freight train, day after day after day, and I don't think President Obama is concerned about re-election 4 years from now. I think he's concerned about transforming America into the very liberal image that he sees.
All right, Jen joins us on the Republican line from Mesa, Arizona.
Yes, first of all, I'm thrilled that Representative King is there. I called his office a few weeks ago after watching C-SPAN and on the immigration committee you sat on, sir, and I loved it. You were the only one asking questions about anything. I mean, they were just beating up on our poor Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and I loved it when you turned over to the head of the committee and said, well, I was told he wasn't invited. She goes, well, he was invited, and you said, he was really invited? She goes, well, we knew he didn't want to come. I loved it. And the other thing, you were going to find out from my so-called police chief who paid his way. I mean, it's amazing he had all these facts, but all of a sudden he couldn't tell anybody who paid his way to that. But what I want to say about this policy towards Latin America, all these people that keep calling in from the left and screaming at the bushes for how they've tortured people, why aren't these same people and the ACLU calling about these thugs that run these Latin American countries? I mean, can you imagine? This would be like being at the Hilton if these people were at Gitmo. I mean, do people realize what they're torturing the Latin American people in these jails of Chavez and all these? Do they realize that, sir?
I don't think they do realize that. I went down to Gitmo about a month ago and looked at the enemy combatants down there and toured the entire thing. There have never been prisoners that have been treated as good as that. They're in air conditioning. They set the temperature. They get a choice of 9 meals off a menu per day. There was no waterboarding that took place in Gitmo, nor in the Western Hemisphere, contrary to these reports that keep coming out. There are 240 of the worst down there. And if they are released, there will be innocent people killed. We know that there is torture taking place on political prisoners in some of the countries in South America. That also includes Cuba and under Castro. And that is an outrage. But what the Americans have done is treated these prisoners with the greatest deference any prisoners have ever been treated. And I think if you could see what's going on, the attacks on our guards every day down there, every day there are guards attacked. And the worst we can do to the worst of them is limit their outdoor exercise to 2 hours a day.
Stafford, Connecticut. Carl joins us on the Democrats line.
Yes, good morning. Congressman King, Mr. King, I'd like to know, are you in denial? Because what you're saying about they they didn't do no waterboarding on the prisoners and stuff like that?
I said it didn't happen in the Western Hemisphere, sir.
Are you sure about that?
Yes.
All right. Back to this.
It happened. It just didn't happen in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay.
To 3 of them.
Okay. What I really want to ask you about Latin America, because, and then again, you know, it seems as if you're in denial that U.S. did do some, you know, awful things to these country. You know, you can go back in history, but with Mr. Obama trying to get the country together and stop this foolishness, child play, because really it's a child play. You know, like we are superior to these people. We got to cut these things out, man. These are modern time. If we really and truly want peace in the world, we got to cut these things out.
Okay, Congressman.
Well, there's not a lot of specifics there to address, but I just think of the previous, the lady who was a previous caller, and she talked about the immigration hearings. And one of the critics of how we deal with people was and I believe that was the same hearing. He was a very vocal critic, and I finally asked him that of all the countries in the world, who has the best record on human rights? And it surprised me. His answer immediately was the United States of America. I think we have the best record on human rights. One of the reasons we have this kind of discussion is because we're doing our very best to try to scrub these things out and do the best and treat people as well as we possibly can. I think we do, and I think we're making progress to treat them even better, and I saw it at Gitmo.
Denver joins. Sam is joining us. Good morning, Sam.
Good morning. First of all, thank you for letting me talk this morning. I'm an independent, and I'm also an African in America, and I didn't vote for Obama. And I think, really, if we're really honest about what's really happening in Latin America and his visit, we can honestly say that his course of dealing with those dialogues was the proper way of trying to build a bridge to those folks to let them know that there is a possibility that America is going to decide to do business differently with these folks. And it's always important when people have been harmed that you listen and see how it's possible for folks to make an amend. And if that amend is possible, then it's pragmatic and also good business.
Well, Sam, that's a reasonable approach to this, and I would just propose a different approach that's also reasonable, and that is that when the President of the United States leads on our diplomatic policy, when he does a handshake and a glad handshake and a pat on the arm and a big grin with Hugo Chavez, that image goes around the world and it says there's no consequence to challenging the United States and directly trying to undermine us. So there's another way to do these things. I think your point's right, that we need to identify our disagreements and find out where we can agree and move forward. But a lot of that can happen between back channel and through diplomatic outreach from the State Department and other emissaries from the White House. I suggest that's the right way to go, and if you can find points to agree, then you bring your leaders together and you actually do an agreement and you do a handshake on something that's meaningful. That would be the approach that I would use, and I would say also that President Obama has essentially offered that he would consider taking down the missile defense shield that exists in Eastern Europe to protect from Iranian missiles if the Russians would go talk to the Iranians about ending their nuclear effort. I think that's the wrong approach. When you offer with something you're willing to give up and ask someone who is in collaboration with the Iranians to carry out a policy negotiation, there's no way we win out of that. The Iranians aren't going to back up. The Russians want the missiles down, and the two of them will figure out how they can get us to slow down or capitulate ourselves. So I know that over in that part of the world, the Germans told me consistently thinking geopolitically leads to conflict. It may, it doesn't always, but failure to think geopolitically leads to capitulation, and that can't happen to the United States of America, Sam.
All right, one last phone call for Representative Steve King, Pittsburgh. Good morning, John.
Good morning. I've been listening, and it seems that King is directing all of the anger coming out of Venezuela that's directed to the people, and it's really the past administration. When he referred at the United Nations about the smell of sulfur, he was talking specifically about one human being, and that was Bush. And I really believe that all of this propaganda that the Republican Party is spreading right now is only to protect corporations. Chavez is a nationalist, and major multinational corporations are fearful of him.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Mr. King?
I would just say, John, would you ask yourself if that had been said, if Chavez had said those things about President Obama rather than President Bush, would you be making these same remarks? I suspect not. But thank you. I appreciate your opinion. I appreciate being here this morning.
Just one last final question for you. What changes would you like to see from the Obama administration when it comes to Latin American policy?
I think we need to send a lot of people down there. I think we need to engage in commerce and in trade. I really want to see a vote on the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. That's important for our national security and for theirs, and to support freedom and to limit the expansion threat that exists from Venezuela. Those things would be important. I'd like to be able to go back to South America, have people there that know Americans, know American policy, and look forward to doing business with us.
All right, Mr. King, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Greta.
Up next.